I have an outstanding aesthetic.
Do we need to talk about your Crocs?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Plain Truth, a Holy Spirited podcast. I am Maggie Ulmer, and I am on Zoom with
Scott Kisker,
David Watson,
and our special guest
is Brian Russell.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm great. It's so great to be with all of you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Brian, for our listeners, please, we know your name, Brian Russell, but go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and
Yeah, I've been teaching at Asbury Theological Seminary since 2000 down on the Orlando campus. I'm a professor of biblical studies. I was the former dean and associate provost, but I've been free of that since July 1st, 2021.
Free at last.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Yeah, and obviously that was a great opportunity, but I can tell already that my own soul is doing a little bit better even in the 6 weeks since that happened. And I'm also I work with pastors. I have a coaching program called Deep Dive Spirituality, and I have a new book coming out that I'm super excited about on centering prayer, called Centering Prayer: Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. It'll be out on September the 14th.
And that's from Paraclete Press, isn't it?
Yeah, Paraclete Press.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So the great thing is you've been freed from your administration. That means you must have atoned for your sins somehow. I mean, that's all I can think of.
That's true. And I thought my goal was to do a decade, and I just made it 9 years. So I guess I got 1 year off early.
Yeah.
I guess I've got more atonement to do.
You definitely do, David.
Yeah.
1 year off for good behavior. Yeah. So I just think it's hilarious. It's the only time that the theological concept of purgatory ever enters this conversation is in relation to academic administration.
Yes. Yeah. Generally, I'm not a fan, but it feels like I should get something, right, for administrating. Like, it's got to get some benefit in the hereafter. Can't just.
Well, if I have to be in purgatory, you have to be there with me.
I hope to God that's not how it works.
Right on. Well, so your book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life. You mentioned before we started recording that you were like, well, that's a bold, that you wouldn't necessarily have given it that subtitle, that the boldness of that subtitle, but I fully agree with that idea. I think it can change your life.
Yeah, I think it absolutely can too. The only thing I found slightly ironic about the title, and this is a popular book, but my academic brain just kind of went off. I hate making big promises because I legit do think if you submit to the practice and play long, it's a long game. It's not like sit in silence for a week, everything's going to shift. But I mean, I've been doing this now for essentially on and off 9 years, but really very heavily 20 minutes a day at least for now 4 or 5 years. And I can say that it's changed my life, but I don't like to lead with that promise like wrote some gimmicky book that's going to fix everything in a month or something. I think it's a process, and we want to grow deep roots. And so when we talk about spiritual formation, yeah, it changes your life, but it's not a quick fix.
I think it's too. A lot of things change your life. Like having a limb amputated also changes your life, right? It's not like, it's what publishers think. Will sell books, right? And maybe they're right, and it's fine. The point is the content, but yeah.
Yeah, and my original title was going to be just to make it sound super Western. I wanted it to be Centering Prayer in the Journey to Love, because what I noticed in my life is I grew deeper and deeper in, love for God, love for neighbor, and even love for self. And that was the idea. So their title's a little cleaner because it's just Centering Prayer, but that was where I was going with the book, essentially. It's Centering Prayer in the Journey to Love.
Of all the things in the sort of the churchy Christian pantheon of gimmicks and things that get sold, I think the least gimmicky one, the least sort of, flashy one, if you want to say, it has to be centering prayer. It has to be contemplative prayer. It's the least exciting sounding one. However, when you engage it on a regular basis, you see and feel the changes in yourself right away, or not right away, but it's undeniable. At some point, you're like, well, I'm definitely better.
Yeah. Take up the process of sitting in silence every day. That's like the opposite of the 7 steps you need to take to fix whatever is wrong with you, right? Or whatever. This is just a discipline and a process that, can open you up.
On the issue of titles, I found that most publishers don't care what you want to call your book at all. And that's why I have a book that's called Key United Methodist Beliefs.
What are you talking about? That's a super exciting title, David.
Well, they changed it, though. They obviously care, right? I mean, how many times have I had a title changed by the publisher, and then you're like, oh, what was that? Why? I don't even understand what your title means, right? That's when the academic brain goes off, and you're like, that makes no sense.
All right.
Is that why you have a book called Longing for Spring?
No comment.
Right. We don't need to step on landmines. Tell us a little bit about what brought this book about. You said you've been practicing centering prayer, sitting silently every day for quite a long time now. So.
Yeah. It comes out of a real painful part of my life. Probably the most pain I've actually experienced in my life. Back in 2010, I was actually on sabbatical of all things, writing a different book, and literally I just celebrated my 20th anniversary in my first marriage, so everybody can see where this is about to go. And my marriage literally just almost ended overnight. I always say maybe I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. I was, trying to be fully invested in my first wife. Again, I'm not going to say anything bad about her and bless her and the whole thing, but she basically didn't want to be married anymore. And I ended up basically being a single father, wondering if I was the Asbury Seminary was going to keep me on as a professor, because obviously, the goal wasn't to have professors getting divorced. I was wondering if I was going to lose my ordination. I mean, I wonder if I was going to be bankrupt. And so basically it just sent me in this spiral of just complete grief, terror. I lost 30 pounds in the month of November of 2010. So I dropped down to my college weight, literally it looked like I just didn't eat. So I'm completely fried on the insides. I go back from sabbatical and I'm teaching, and it's like I literally felt like I was teaching on fumes. Obviously, going through a divorce creates all kinds of legal issues, and I remember I was talking to a friend in the spring of 2011. And one day they said, Brian, you just sound like you're going crazy, because I do talk fast. I'm from a Midwesterner. And so I guess I was in super hyperdrive this day. And somebody tells you you're going crazy. I listen. I'm like, wow. So I immediately just went outside. I'm like, I got to get outside and get some fresh air. And it's Orlando. So thank goodness, it's usually sunny down here. And the spring is always probably the nicest time of the year here in terms of not super hot. And so I'm out for this walk. And I didn't wear my headphones. So I wasn't doing my professor slouch like I usually do, just walking around thinking. I was just walking down the sidewalk this day. And then all of a sudden, it was like everything froze. I remember hearing a bird singing, and I looked up and I could see the bird. And this will sound kind of odd, but I'm so stuck in my head. I actually just saw the bird, saw leaves on the tree. I could smell flowers, and it just felt like everything froze. And I had this really interesting religious experience at that exact moment where I felt like God was saying, Brian, you're 100% loved, and I'm enough. And again, I don't know if that was an audible voice, but I really sensed that on the inside. And I kind of call that my introduction to contemplative practice, that outside of my typical experience up to that time. And again, that wasn't the time when everything fixed in my life, because I still had a long way to go. But when I realized my brain could literally freeze, like I could just get this moment of breaking up my thoughts, which is exactly what happened there, I thought, okay, I need to figure out how I can do that again. And so I experienced I looked in and learned about some breathing practices, or just doing different kinds of ways to focus on things. And then I slowly was introduced by a colleague into this whole centering prayer. And I started that just in small doses because I thought, wow, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, is just sitting here in silence. And I've, slowly worked up to the full 20 minutes. So over time, but that's how I got into it. This was my response to my divorce and my goal. And I'm so grateful for this thought. In the middle of the whole divorce stuff, I just had a sense that, okay, I'm going to get on the other side of this. And I have to be grateful. Asbury was super good to me. President Tennant was really good. And a lot of listeners know the wider seminary, and I had a great team that just supported me and, let me, stay on as a professor, and made sure I had, some accountability and some help for the whole thing. But even beyond all that stuff, is I had a real sense that, I want to be better on the other side of this and not just come out bitter. Because I know a lot of people that have gone through stuff that, they end up not liking women. And I'm talking about from a male perspective now, then they're just kind of nasty. And I don't want to be that way. I want to be a better man when this whole thing's done. And so I just opened myself up to some stuff that I'd never done before. Like I took seriously my diet for the first time, and I added all these, the journaling practice that even goes longer than the centering prayer stuff. I started doing prayer, a form of prayer of examen at that point, or examine at that point. And I've done that for over a decade now too. But so really the silence, the journaling and the centering prayer unpacked my insides. And the other thing that was critical for me in the middle of the divorce was I decided, and again, if you want to look at the facts, which we're not going to do here, this isn't true what I'm saying, but I decided my divorce was 100% my fault. So I wasn't going to blame anybody for what happened, and I was going to take full responsibility. And so I had a prayer to God, Lord, open up my insides and bring every bit of darkness that I'm not aware of into your light so that I can be healed by your grace. And so I kind of had those mindsets. I want to be better. I'm going to take full responsibility, and I want to be healed. And I think moving into the journaling and the centering prayer with those mindsets. And again, I'm not pretending like I'm perfect or I actually lived out those intentions every single day. I'd made plenty of hiccups, and I've done stupid stuff in the process of getting divorced and probably said some nasty things to people. So I'm not playing saint on this whole thing, but I had those mentalities. And, looking back 11 years later, I kind of moved into the 2.0 version. And I, again, don't claim perfection or any of those things, but I can see that the Lord has really worked on my insides in profound ways, which is what led me to write this book about one of the things that was critical in my essentially, I would say reconstruction.
Wow.
That's a lot.
You're a Bible scholar, not like a practical theologian or whatever one would be to write a book like this. And yet this is just kind of coming out of, what God, the fact that even, all of us who are, quote, scholars in something, we're also just ordinary Christians. We're struggling to live faithful lives. And, God gave you something to help other people, and you're wanting to be faithful to write down what you'd been given. I mean, I think that's super important.
And that's what was fun about the book, because I didn't even mean to write a book. I just started writing, because I write about 500 words every day. It's just kind of one of my disciplines. I just started writing little pieces about my centering prayer experience as I began to unpack this. I think I started writing the book about 3 years ago now. And again, I just kind of poured out about 60,000 words poured out, and then edited it down. And I really jumbled all these little pieces together into this manuscript. And then what was fun about this is, like, I always joke that I've always struggled to publish. Like, I usually get rejected at least once on everything I've ever done. And this book literally almost wrote itself. I mean, it was me. And then I would go to Paraclete, my first choice for Spiritual Formation Press, and they took the book right off the bat. And so it's just been one of those. It's just been the whole book has just been a wonderful experience, remembering my own journey. And then it's just a fun writing, because writing's not always fun, but it was just fun. And then it's just been so fun getting the book published, which isn't always fun either.
Oh my gosh. If there could be an anointing for making writing fun, I would like some of that. I think all the people here would like that.
Yeah, definitely.
But so you also mentioned, I forget if we were recording or not at this point, because we do so much chit chatting before we actually start recording this podcast. But you mentioned that you had been reading, that you read a lot about the topic before, that you just, you did, I think what most people do when they sort of discover something new, you just kind of are like, let me find out all about it. So was there any, what did you come across that really sort of like lit your fire?
Yeah, and it's really funny too. I was in Wilmore at the Wilmore campus of Asbury, and over 2 nights I met 2 of my good friends, and I don't necessarily have to give their names, but they both told me. Well, my first friend it was a Thursday night told me, "Hey, you need to read this book. It's called Hindering Prayer and the Healing of the Unconscious." And then literally the next morning, I had an appointment with another friend, the guy that actually introduced me to centering prayer. And he goes, "Brian, I have a book that I think you need to read." And he actually hands me the very book that my friend told me I needed to read and gave me his extra copy. And so that book and that's why I ended up kind of launching into the book. So the things that I found that I needed some help with was, like and this is in my book, and I found out that this was common, but like I actually thought something was really wrong with me when I would sit in silence for a long time, because when I first started doing it, and again, not at first, but after I'd made a commitment, I just started noticing I'd be sitting in silence doing my centering prayer, which is essentially, you close your eyes, you're quiet, and when you become aware that you're in a thought, you simply use a prayer word to recenter you, essentially. Like I always use Jesus when I do that. But, what I noticed, I'm sitting out on my back patio doing the centering prayer. I used to do it after I would walk. I'd come back and just sit for, started with 5 minutes. But once I get to 20, I'm sitting there. And I realized early on, instead of sitting with the Lord, I would just think of all the people that I was mad at. And so I had all this anger coming up. And I think that I thought something was wrong with me. And then to make even worse, sometimes I'd sit out there and I'd start thinking about sex. And I'm thinking, geez, I'm supposed to be sitting quietly with God, and all I am is mad. And then I got distracted, started thinking about sex. And then I'm like, oh, geez, God's going to like fry me for this. I'm supposed to be. And then, and then it struck me. It's like, wow, I'm sitting here with God, and God knows everything I'm thinking about. So, okay, I just need to release that. And then as I did the research on stuff that monastics get confronted with when they're in silence. And again, I have to plead. I'm not blaming anybody, but I didn't know anything about these deeper spiritual formation practices at that point. I realized that was completely common, and that comes out of this whole, what turned into the 7 deadly sins stuff.
I was going to say, you still got greed, envy.
Right.
Well, yeah. Well, no, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly. So, so then I started reading Evagrius Ponticus's stuff on the, he called it the 8 evil thoughts. He even expanded pride into 2 things. He thought that was such a big deal for folks, but that would be like an example of what I ended up researching. And so in Keating, Thomas Keating talks about inner purification and in healing. And so those are the things that really helped me. And then what I tried to do in my book is, because again, I almost felt like Forrest Gump and all this stuff. The right things came into my life at the right time. And so I just kind of wove in my own story and how I reacted to those different, like the 8 distracting thoughts that Evagrius talked about, and just observed all that stuff. So it all kind of made it into the book too. And I just read as much as I could. And then I've tried to, not that centering prayer books are hard to read, but I tried to take all the best insights from Thomas Merton, Cynthia Bourgeois, Thomas Keating, America O'Madigan, even read some of Richard Rohr's books, some of the more common authors that write about these things, and tried to distill as much wisdom as I could to help people, if they're going to do this practice, to open themselves up fully for all of God's healing. And as a Wesleyan, I've been pondering the role that something like this plays in, say, entire sanctification, and even what we talk about with infirmities when we talk about entire sanctification. And I'm not going to completely able to defend everything, but I've always thought the infirmities was kind of the hole in the holiness movement, because it's like I can just say it was unconscious or I didn't mean to do it. And I've pondered, does sitting in silence actually bring up some of the things that we might call infirmities and make them not blind spots anymore, but actually bring them into the presence, and allows God's grace to even penetrate even deeper into our lives. So there's a thread that runs through the book about that as well, which I call really that journey to love, which is this, a theme that runs through my entire book.
That's awesome.
What I find interesting about what you're talking about, it's, part of my practice has been sitting in silence for well over a decade now, but I never call it centering prayer. I never even thought of that. All I've always thought about it was I'm letting God minister to me. And it doesn't matter what I think about or what happens or what doesn't happen. I'm just available to be ministered to. And mine's like I only do 10. Like I just do 10 minutes, but I don't know how I missed that this is like similar to centering prayer or whatever centering prayer is. And I often, and I too, I'll use breath prayers like the Jesus prayer sometimes just to chill out.
Well, this isn't something that gets a lot of airtime in churches, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really teach people about this kind of prayer. I remember the first person I really ever heard talk about this was Sarah Coakley. I was either in seminary or grad school. I don't remember which one, but she did a talk at Perkins when I was there on what she was calling silent prayer, which sounds a lot like what you're talking about, Brian. And so, and I think at least part of the issue is that we don't really have much of a concept of divine agency in the church. So if we just sit there, we think nothing's happening. But what if God is eternally and consistently in the business of sanctifying us whenever we give him the chance to do so? And so I think this would be a good resource for local churches to begin to teach people in the church about another aspect of prayer. Probably most of our prayers are petitionary with very low expectation. But I think this would be a great resource for pastors to use in churches to teach people about another aspect of prayer they just may not have thought about before.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And my book was written before this whole COVID-19 pandemic stuff.
Wow.
So it was already done. And matter of fact, I sent the book proposal off, I think, a week after the lockdown actually kicked in. So the book was all done and stuff. But what I noticed, and I've noticed this in my own work with pastors, is the pastors that I'd worked with that I introduced centering prayer into their lives, they had a completely different, again, everybody was in the same boat. They had to put everything online. It was very anxiety driven and very difficult for every pastor. And everybody's listening to this knows that's true if they're a pastor. But I noticed the centering prayer, that whole discipline, did exactly what you said, David. It had actually opened up spaces for people so that, everybody had some level of freak out over the COVID-19, and it's obviously been a very serious, and still is, problem. But they had a different experience of having to almost be forced into solitude than the people that weren't ready for it. And so I think this is actually a perfect practice for everyone to at least experiment with, because one of the scary things is when you are by yourself and you're undistracted, you do get confronted with the deepest truths about yourself. And obviously some of those can be beautiful things, but some of those can be painful things, and trauma can show up and stuff too. So I believe this is a real tool that Christians need. And that's really where the centering prayer came out of, because it is just contemplative prayer that goes all the way back to the earliest desert fathers and mothers. But Keating and his associates, back when they started centering prayer, that's a recent phrase that goes back to, I think, like roughly 1970. They were just trying to create a short method and I don't want to call it a hack method at contemplative prayer. That's not fair, but a method that anybody who wasn't a monastic could practice to make it easier to actually gain a deeper relationship with God through this prayer of silence. Because God does heal us in silence, but silence by itself can sometimes be scary also.
This is interesting to me because I read a lot of these people actually, and I've always wondered if there was like a slight difference between contemplative and centering prayer, and not in the sense of it's like, I mean, if there is a difference, it's a very nuanced difference. But sometimes I think of like what I feel like you're describing is sort of like a consenting, like a presenting myself to God for healing, and contemplative prayer sometimes has always struck me as somewhat based, like I'm contemplating the goodness of God, which, and I mean, I'm bringing this up because I don't know, I think it's interesting. It's like you're talking about, the types of thoughts that enter our heads, or how everyone who has entered into silent prayer, you have to contend with the busyness of your own mind. And sometimes even in adoration, we can not consent. We can not let God do what he needs to do. We can sort of say, Lord, I love you, I love you, I love you. And at the same time, still be holding him at a distance.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I've thought about it. I mean, to me, the distinction ends up being is like the practice of centering prayer is essentially saying, I'm going to surrender my thoughts when I become aware of them, and that includes things like, I've been sitting and centering prayer, and I get this wonderful idea. Wow, this would be a great message someday. But I consciously, like, you know what? I'm sitting in silence with God, and I'm surrendering even that thought, or, or I get a thought like, wow, I really feel like God loves me. Well, that's fantastic, but it's still a thought. So I have to surrender that too. So it really is just opening myself up. And that is the practice, is an intention. And to me, contemplative prayer ends up being in those moments where outside of thought, and this would be the apophatic tradition, the whole thing that, this is the wrong language, and Scott's going to help me with this one. Like sometimes it's more like a soul to soul experience. It's like, right. I'm going to, my own thoughts, no matter how good, bad, or ugly they are, I'm going to surrender those simply so the whole person of who I am can be in God's presence, and my thoughts aren't going to block God from interacting with me with his love. That's kind of my layman's way of describing what that happens. And I would see those moments, which we can't control, because all we're doing, as you said, I'm going to consent. I'm going to sit in silence. I'm going to set my intention to be in silence with the God who loves me, Jesus Christ, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But I can't then control or manipulate God by what I do. I'm just going to open myself up and make myself available. And that is the practice. And and then God does do what God does with the silence, but that's just my intention from my side.
That's awesome.
And I think,
go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I think the distinction between these things, like, am I doing contemplative prayer? Am I doing centering prayer? I just think that's unimportant, because what sitting in silence before God and allowing God to minister to you however he wants to minister to you is a way of practicing that God loves you, even if you don't really know it yet.
Yeah, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing, David talked about how, most of the time we think our prayers are petitions and we have a low expectation. And really the reason we have a low expectation is we don't really believe that God loves us in the nitty gritty, right? Like we theoretically believe in this whole cross thing, and that, the sins of the whole world are taken care of. But my infected toenail, do I really want to, that's just too little for God to be bothered with, or whatever it is, right? And so I think it's this process of learning that we are genuinely loved, no matter how messed up we are. And the only way you can learn that is to experience / know / allow God to express that to you. And that can happen, it happens through actual answered prayers, right? I mean, when we're in church and we recount places where God has intervened, sometimes dramatically in people's lives to answer prayer, it's an example of God particularly loving. And the same thing, what happens to us when we're just sitting in silence, or what doesn't happen to us. It's just us acknowledging that we have a God who genuinely loves us. And, if I'm hanging out at someone's house and, nothing has to happen. You know what I mean? Like if I go over to David's, nothing has to happen necessarily, right? We're just hanging out and he's showing me some really dumb YouTube video that I'm going to pretend to enjoy. And, it doesn't have to happen, but it's about being together. It's about having a different kind of relationship with God and that relationship is healing. That's what that's the relationship itself that's healing.
Yeah. Actually, I love that, and that's been my experience. And I know for me, for whatever reason, and again, I don't know if centering prayer is for everybody, but I know for myself, being a person who essentially has lived inside his head for most of his life, and I mean, it's my brain that led me to being a professor and writing books and stuff. But that ended up being an impediment to my own spiritual growth, and I literally just needed to learn to do exactly what you just said, Scott, which is sit in silence. And the way that I describe it, again, this will be funny from an Asbury professor, but I think Paul Tillich, the theologian, got this probably the best because he always talked about grace. And the one thing I do love about Tillich's work is he has this great definition of grace. He talks about it accepting the fact that you're unconditionally accepted. And I would say if I could put in one sentence what centering prayer has helped me, it's to experience that unconditional love that I'm just loved apart from my thoughts, apart from what I do, apart from all the roles that I play. And that's been the transformational moment. And, and I think about Wesley when he talks about like witness of the Spirit and stuff. I think for whatever reason, somehow that witness must have been blocked in my interior, or I just processed it completely intellectually. But it was this sitting in silence that really brought my whole soul to life. And again, in a way that I had not experienced this, even though, I was an ordained pastor. I'd been going to church my whole life. I'd had dramatic revival experiences, all those things. But it was sitting in silence that for once and for all, know without a doubt that God absolutely loves me beyond just an intellectual idea, but feel it inside my entire body. And that's been awesome.
So, what are some of the things that you talk about in your book that are about sort of those initial first attempts?
Yeah.
Because the beginning of this practice is kind of rough going.
No, it is. And it can be rough going after a while too. You just know what to do. I think the hardest thing that anybody will find when they just sit in silence, and this can be saying 1 minute, let alone doing 20. If I could do everything over, I'd probably say go to 20 right off the bat, or some significant, at least 10, because I just slowly stepped up. And once I did 20, it was easy. It was surprisingly easy, but the thing that you're confronted with is how busy your mind is, even if you can become aware that it's busy. So probably the first lesson is realizing that you're thinking all the time. And again, there's nothing wrong with this. And centering prayer does not erase your brain. It's always so important. That's not even the goal, but it's to kind of be able to step back and then catch yourself in thoughts and then simply surrender those. And so a lot of times people think, well, I had to say Jesus, mentally, a dozen times or whatever, maybe even more in a session. And one of the things I'll immediately just kind of coach on, because I usually do this with students, I'll do it in a group to try to teach because I can tell you what it is, but you got to do it and then get feedback. And I think one of the classic lessons is, geez, you had to do 50 times, say your prayer word. Well, that's 50 times that you intentionally returned to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you're doing. And so that's probably the first big lesson, is just to realize you're learning to surrender your thoughts. I always think, David will like this. This is my take on Matthew 16:24. It's not a Seminary prayer verse, but Jesus says, if anybody would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, follow me. And so I always kind of picture when I'm doing my silence, I'm following Jesus. So I get distracted by a bird and turn my head. Well, I got to go back to Jesus. Wow, I got this great idea. Got to go back to Jesus. I'm talking to Peter next to me. I got to talk to Jesus. I got to go back to Jesus. And so that's probably the big lesson right up the bat is you're going to be distracted probably most of the time, but that's the whole point. You're becoming aware of it. And then you're returning to Jesus. So it's like going to the gym and you're doing push-ups or some weights. Every repetition is building spiritual muscles that you probably didn't even know you had.
Yeah. Well, and you feel them.
Yeah.
That gym metaphor is like, you feel them after a while.
Yeah, and you don't, and just like the gym, you might be sore, like, wow, that was really painful, and you don't see any muscles for a while. So that is the right metaphor to kind of think about. But that would be the first big thing is the thoughts, and then the second thing is usually if you've done it for a while, you start getting those evil thoughts or distracting thoughts. The things like the 7 deadly sins start emerging out of your unconscious, and then that's the next thing. You just got to learn to not freak out about it, and that's where Keating came up with like the 4 R's. You don't resist your thoughts. You don't retain a thought. You don't react to a thought. You just gently return to the sacred word. And that whole reaction has to do with, I think, when you get a troubling thought, we have a tendency to want to jam it back down. Like when I'm sitting out feeling angry and remembering stuff, people that had done me wrong, I could have like, oh my gosh, I got to repress all my anger. Instead, it's like, you know what? Just like in a lament psalm, I'm just going to release that to God and let God heal me. So those are probably the 2 biggest things, recognizing how busy your mind is, and then learning not to freak out if you get a painful thought that comes up while you're doing this.
I just want to clarify, when you say Keating, are you talking about the Trappist monk?
Yes. Yeah. Thomas Keating. He and a couple of his colleagues, let's see, there was Menninger, and I'm not going to get all the names. There were 3 Trappist monks who, I think the story is, they've been doing these sort of practices for, centuries, if not a millennia or more. And then they saw a lot of Roman Catholic youths. I don't know if they were priests or they were just Roman Catholics. They were learning to do transcendental meditation back in the 60s. And they realized, we got a problem here. It's like, they don't need to be going to learn this Hindu method. We have this Christian practice. And so they went and they pulled out the prayer of, or the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a medieval text, and some other things. And they developed this method out of that. So I'm talking about Thomas Keating, the Trappist monk.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you ever experience this may sound, do you ever have, in my experience, it's not always pleasant to allow God to minister to you. Like we say, I leave it up to God. It sounds really peaceful. And I somaticize, meaning everything. Right. That's why I have arthritis, right? Every stress I have, I somehow work it out in my body. But like, I'll get like nauseous, and the things like just because God is working on you doesn't mean it always feels good. And I don't want people to have the and then the problem is if you think that it's going to be this kind of peace experience all the time, then you think you're just doing it wrong. When really, no, there's just some surgery going on and it doesn't feel good.
No, that's exactly right. And that's really where I wrote the book. So the second half of the book really does go into what happens when you become confronted with the truth about yourself. And it can be painful. And, and that's one of the pieces that I've noticed in my own life. And that's why I put my own narrative in there. So, it's kind of embarrassing to say that, wow, when I was sitting out doing this, I started realizing how mad I was. That sounds not very holy. Or I'm thinking about sex while I'm doing these things. I wanted to let people know, because in my reading of the literature, they would list some of this stuff, but they always pushed it back to like St. Anthony fighting demons in the desert. Well, you know what? I found I had my own own demons I had to be confronted with. And in fact, I don't think they're literally demons. These are just our unconscious thoughts, but it feels like your inner demons show up, and that isn't fun. And that's why I wanted to write the book, so that people wouldn't be freaked out and they would have resources and understand that this is actually the way that God heals us. And, this will sound funny. I know this is a, very Wesleyan podcast, and I've even said the word holiness. All right. But what centering prayer has done for me is, like I always say, it's like I feel at some level less holy than I used to. And I'm not confessing sins when I say that, but what it's done is, like, whatever I thought I'd attained at some point, I've realized that, wow, I have a long way to go in God's love, because God shows me what's on my insides. I've seen that my motives are often mixed, for example, and I just have to release those. And basically what I've learned over the last decade is, and it's two things. It's like, number one, I've been confronted with the complexity and even contradictory notions of some of the things that are going on in my own soul. But because God has shown me those things and begun to heal and work through that, I've noticed when I interact with other people now that I don't simply say, and this is funny, and we've seen this especially in our culture now, everybody's it's either black or white, you're either a 0 or a 10, and there's no nuance. Mm-hmm. I can see myself wanting to, like, oh, that person's just a blank. And then I'm like, what? No, that person is just as complicated as me. And maybe they said something that sounds like they might be blank, but I need to stop and allow that other person to have the same level of complexity, mixed motives, contradictory thoughts that I have, and not make this person a unit, just a one thing, when myself, I might be 100 things. And so, and again, I think, I don't know if that answers something about what we're kind of describing, but that's what I've seen. And so, yeah, when we do this process, it is wonderful looking back, but it's not necessarily enjoyable all the way through the process. And there will be times when it can be really painful. That's why I also recommend, this isn't so much in the books, but I do my journaling after I do centering prayer, and not to process, because you're not supposed to try to remember what was going on. But I do give myself the privilege of, I always write down, what am I grateful for? And then I spend a little time in my journal every day. And it's interesting, Scott, I mean, we're a lot the same. I carry a lot of stuff in my body. So I always write down, I started doing this right in the middle of my divorce, like, what's really bothering me? And so after sitting in silence for 20 minutes, practicing some gratitude, for the last 10 years, I write down every day if I feel like tightness in my neck, or I feel anxiety in my stomach, or my chest feels tight. I try to figure out what's really going on. And so I ask what's really, and I try to journal 3, 4, 5 minutes a day. And again, it didn't take that long sometimes, but I've been kind of trying to unpack even my body so that, I can let God unclog everything, so that when I show up, I can be a vehicle of God's grace, to the best of my ability with God's help. And so I see this as a embodied practice too, of sitting in silence.
Mm-hmm. David, what are you thinking over there? You've been quiet.
No, just listening. I also wonder, Brian, if you've ever experienced some kind of spiritual attack while you're engaged in centering prayer.
Well, I would say the only way I could process is that I would say yes. Like when I first ran into those angry thoughts, for example, I thought that was a spiritual attack, and maybe it is. I haven't thought, Anthony always talked about, he's fighting the demon of anger, the demons of lust, the demons. And so he saw it that way, I guess. So it could be. I'd like to see it as, if it's an attack, God immediately lets you redeem it by handing it off to him. So I guess I see them as gifts that you get confronted with who you are, and then you get the option of not dealing it on your own by repressing it, by just simply open-handed giving it to the Lord. So maybe it's a spiritual attack that God can instantly redeem. I'm not sure.
Or the way that the promised land gets cleansed is not actually by your sword.
Yeah, it's good.
the battle is the Lord's, and that's the only way. That's the only way any healing comes about. And the other thing I was thinking too is we often think about like holiness is where I don't have bad thoughts, right? Where I'm somehow above spiritual attack, if you want to put it that way, or I'm above the sort of, I'm walking on some plane above it, and we kind of go around like what was his name in the SNL sketches, Smiley. I'm good enough and I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. We just have to convince ourselves of this. And what you're talking about is, I think, what is the Wesleyan way of
Jack Handy.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Wesleyan way of sanctification, which is it goes the other direction, right? You become aware how common you are, how common your humanity is in the struggles that you have. And you slowly grow the kind of compassion for others that Jesus has for you. That's what you were talking about right there with like, everybody's super complicated. Everybody's messy. And yet they're also loved, right? They're not my enemy because they think differently than I do. They're just as messed up as I am. And
I love that. I mean, that's been my experience on this. Like, I loved every way you phrase that, Scott.
I always sometimes, so I work in a ministry, a renewal ministry, and we do a lot of pastors and churches. And one of the things that we encounter quite a bit is just the culture of activity, of busyness in churches. And so sometimes, when you talk to people about spiritual formation or disciplines, they always want information and activity. And so I kind of always find myself in this position of, no, it's okay to do nothing. You should really embrace nothing. And I'm just wondering, in your experience in coaching or talking with pastors, do you encounter this? Do you find this to be a difficulty or a struggle? Or
Well, absolutely, and it's a struggle for a couple of different reasons. But yeah, and it's for everybody. The old joke about like doing a time of silence is like people say I don't have time to do that, and then the pushback was always, well, if you don't have time to do 20 minutes, you should do 40 minutes. Is kind of the advice for folks.
Wow,
and I think that's really powerful advice. So what I try to encourage people to do is, and again, in different seasons of life, it's hard. Like, I always do centering prayer now. My kids are grown up. And so like my wife and I, we wake up, have a cup of coffee, and we do this together pretty much every morning. But, if I have little kids, that isn't happening because I'm going to have to, so you have to recognize the time of the life, but you really just have to make it a priority and say, you know what, this investment in my spiritual formation is worth it in and of itself. And then just trust that by opening up that space, you'll see results. Because, when we're talking to pastors, we all know pastors have really difficult jobs. And the biggest thing to me from my personal experience, and then just coaching pastors and being a seminary professor for all these years, and, and seeing especially second career folks come in, is that the pastor's spiritual formation can be complicated because you get paid to do it, sort of. Like, I'm paid to study the Bible. I'm paid to pray. And we end up confusing our identity as a person loved by Jesus Christ with the role that I play even as a pastor. And so I think a silence and solitude practice collapses that, because silence and solitude is all about sitting with God as my truest self. And so that's just a powerful transformation that I think once a pastor or anybody, a Christian experiences this, it becomes part of their life, because we want to minister. And I like Bernard of Clairvaux. He's one of my favorite medieval writers. And he has one of his sermons on the Song of Songs, which kind of funny that he wrote all those sermons anyway on the Song of Songs. But one of my favorites is, I think it's 18. I'll have to double check this, but he talks about how we need to become reservoirs and not just canals in terms of living the Christian life. And what he means by that, and by a canal, I would say he means storm sewer in the modern world, because a canal in those days would have been something that only had water in it when it rained, basically. And too many of us live the Christian life, whatever we get immediately, we breathe it in, immediately gets exhaled, and then we're empty all over again. And Clairvaux was trying to get the folks that he worked with to be reservoirs. And then the water that comes out of a reservoir in this, if you read this, and his sermon's really short too, so people can look this up pretty easily. It's free on the internet if you look up the sermon. Clairvaux is imagining a reservoir where the only thing that comes out of the Christian then is the overflow off the top of the reservoir. And that's the image of spiritual formation that I try to convey to everybody now. So it's not just do this thing so I can get more done. It's do this thing so you build these deep wells that then you can minister out of the overflow of God's abundant love for you. So that's kind of how I would, I think, answer your question, Maggie.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love all of these. I love all of these medieval writers about the mystics, contemplative prayer, all of these things, and I love all of the way these things intersect and how they all sort of lead to a path of union with God, but also of clinging. You were talking earlier about entire sanctification, and I think for the purposes of informational topic. I mean, I'm not an academic, but I in my life, married to clergy and working in ministry, I think I find myself a lot of times compartmentalizing topics so that you can explain specific details about things. But the reality is a lot of the life in Christ is all woven together. And so as you're talking about Bernard of Clairvaux, I was thinking about how Teresa of Avila uses the images of mirrors being cleaned off and how light reflects infinitely until it is just this beacon that is perpetually shining forth the presence of God within you. And you find images like that over and over and over again about the overflow or the amplification of God's presence within you. But in order to do it, you have to be still. You have to be still and let all that stuff come to the surface, or get that stuff cleared off of the mirror, or whatever the metaphor is. And I don't know, I'm excited and grateful for your attention to this subject. And I'm excited to get a copy of your book.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
David, you're muted.
Brian, I assume that you can get this in all the standard outlets, right? Amazon and all that.
Yeah, and it's again, depending on when this is, if it's after 9/14, it'll be freely available. It's available for pre-order on Amazon right now. You can get, if you want to order bulk copies, you could direct those to Paraclete Press, because I know we're hoping that churches will pick this up. And I'll even say if a church does pick up a block of books, I'm actually willing to jump on a Zoom call with a group for a few minutes if any churches do actually end up using this, and they can reach out directly to me. And if anybody's listening and wants some just instructions on centering prayer, whether they ever buy my book, I have a little place where you can sign up for a little newsletter, and I'm not a spammer, but it's centeringprayerbook.com. It's a super simple, and you can sign up, and I'll send out some resources on centering prayer. And obviously I would let you know how you could buy my book if you sign up for my email, but I'll give you resources regardless of whether you ever buy it or not. And I just really want to be a blessing to as many people as possible, because God's blessed me, and He brought me through the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life, which was to go through and get divorced, put myself back together, and raise my kids, and try to be a professor at Asbury, and all the different things that I had to do. And I know for a fact that these silence and solitude practices, again, I don't blame anybody. I never knew about this stuff, but God was good enough to put the right people in my life at the right time that taught me. And I'm just trying to be that same voice now to other folks that may not have known that these kind of practices were maybe even Christian, because some people get afraid of the word meditation, but it's not the same. We're literally sitting in silence with God. And, Scott even mentioned the Jesus prayer. I think this is, go back to the spiritual attack question real quick. I think the way that we can confront that up front is I use the Jesus prayer when I start. So it's not like I'm just going to close my eyes and drop into silence. I'm stating my intention up front with God of what I want to happen. So I always start with, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then I drop into the silence at that point. So I think it's important to start with that intention. I'm going to sit with my Lord, the triune God, in silence, and I trust that demonic attacks aren't going to happen in those processes.
Yeah, amen. Well, and if pastors are interested in your coaching, where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can reach out directly. My email is deepdivespirituality@gmail.com, or they could go to my website, brianrussellphd.com.
Nice. Awesome. And your book is available for pre-order, and it is coming out September 14th, and it's your Paraclete Press and available wherever books are sold. Amazon is everybody's best friend. I kind of miss physical bookstores, I have to say.
I do too, but
yeah, me too.
But it is very convenient to have a book just dropped on your front door. Anyway, well, that's been our podcast today, you guys. And after you finish listening to this, you should just sit in silence for 5 minutes.
That'd be fantastic. That's what I do in my book too. I suggest folks that almost every chapter just take a little pause and sit in silence, because you can read about it, but you have to experience it to get for God to do the work that God will do.
Yeah, actually, I just such a tangent, but as you were talking about, like when you have little kids, when I had little kids, I used to go and sit in silence for 10 minutes in the laundry room because I knew my children would not come in there, because that's where laundry happens.
Well, there's a great tip right there. I love it.
Putting chocolate in the vegetable drawer, because
right, exactly. That's exactly right. So anyway, so that's been our podcast, and we're so grateful to Brian for being with us today. You guys, check out his book, Centering Prayer. Sitting quietly in God's presence can change your life. That is the truth. And check us out on Facebook, rate and like the podcast, because it helps people find us and, spreads the goodness of the Plain Truth podcast around. Follow us on Twitter at Holy Spirit Pod, and give us a follow at the Spirit and Truth Twitter account, also Spirit Truth Life. And as always, thank you for listening, and we'll come back to you next time. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.